There is someone in your life right now who costs you more energy than they give back. Maybe it's a colleague who takes credit quietly and assigns blame loudly. A family member who makes every gathering feel like a negotiation you didn't agree to enter. A friend who is warm in private and cutting in public. A manager whose approval is always just slightly out of reach, no matter how well you perform. A partner who can turn a small misunderstanding into a days-long silence. You don't need to be told these people are difficult. You feel it, in the way your energy drops when their name appears on your phone. In the way you rehearse conversations before they happen. In the way you leave an interaction with them feeling smaller, more confused, and somehow responsible for something you can't quite name. But here is what tends to go unexamined. Why does this keep happening? Not just with this person, but across time, across different chapters of your life. Why do certain kinds of people consistently find their way into your closest relationships, your workplaces, your families? And why, despite your intelligence, your self-awareness, and your genuine desire for healthy relationships, do you still find yourself periodically being drained, manipulated, or diminished by them? This is the question at the center of today's documentary. In The Laws of Human Nature, Robert Greene argues that almost all of the difficulty we experience with other people can be traced to a single fundamental problem. We see people as we wish they were, not as they are. We fill in the gaps in our understanding of others with our own projections, our own hopes, our own generous interpretations. And then we are surprised when the person we thought we knew behaves in ways that seem inexplicable. To understand people, we must first understand the hidden forces driving human behavior, not as we imagine them to be, but as they actually are. This video is not about diagnosing difficult people. It is not about labeling them or dismissing them. It is about understanding the psychology behind the behavior that confuses and drains us, so that we can respond with wisdom rather than emotional impulse, so that we can see clearly without becoming cold, so that we can protect ourselves without becoming closed. Let's begin. Section 1. Why difficult people exist. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, "Today I will be the difficult person." This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about difficult behavior. Almost none of it is consciously chosen. The colleague who undercuts you in meetings does not experience himself as someone who undercuts people. The friend who makes you feel guilty for not being available enough does not experience herself as manipulative. The manager whose approval is impossible to earn genuinely believes his standards are fair. The family member who turns every conversation about themselves does not see the pattern you see from the outside. Difficult behavior is almost always the expression of something that has not been examined. It is the outward form of an inner wound. The architecture of difficult behavior. Greene, drawing on decades of historical and psychological study, identifies several core forces that generate the behavior we experience as difficult. The first and most foundational is insecurity. Not the passing self-doubt that most of us feel, but the deep, structural kind. The sense that one's worth is perpetually in question, that approval can be withdrawn at any moment, that one must constantly demonstrate value, defend position, or control the environment to feel safe. From this foundation of deep insecurity, many recognizable behavioral patterns emerge. The person who constantly criticizes others is often, beneath the criticism, terrified of being found inadequate themselves. If they can establish that those around them are flawed, their own flaws are less visible, at least to themselves. The person who seeks to dominate every conversation or meeting is often someone who has never developed a stable enough sense of their own value to feel safe when the attention is elsewhere. Status anxiety, the chronic preoccupation with where one stands relative to others, is another powerful driver. Greene traces this tendency back to our evolutionary history as social creatures. For most of human history, status within the group was literally a matter of survival. Low status meant less access to resources, less protection, less safety. The brain systems that monitored status and responded to threats to it were shaped by millennia of that reality. And those systems are still active, still firing alerts, still generating anxiety and defensive behavior in modern offices, families, and social groups where the actual survival stakes are far lower. Envy, specifically, is one of the most potent and least acknowledged drivers of difficult behavior. Greene devotes considerable attention to it in The Laws of Human Nature, and for good reason. Envy is one of the most universal human emotions and one of the most consistently disguised. We rarely call it by its name, in ourselves or in others. We call it concern or principle or legitimate criticism. But underneath many of the most damaging interpersonal behaviors, the undermining, the gossip, the sudden withdrawal of support at critical moments, envy is often the operating force. Then there is the pattern that psychologists call early conditioning, the particular way that childhood experiences, when they remain unprocessed, continue to shape adult behavior. The person who grew up in an environment where love was conditional and unpredictable may have learned to be controlling because control was the only available response to chaos. The person who was consistently overlooked may have learned that dramatic behavior was the only reliable way to be seen. The person who was frequently shamed may have developed an exquisitely sensitive radar for perceived slights, and a correspondingly disproportionate response to even minor ones. Behavior reveals what words try to hide. The person who confuses and drains you is almost always telling you something true about themselves, just not in a language you were expecting. Section 2. The masks people wear. Greene uses the image of the mask throughout The Laws of Human Nature, and it is worth pausing on because it is more than a metaphor. Every human being, to some degree, manages their self-presentation. We show different facets of ourselves in different contexts. This is not duplicity. It is the basic social competence that allows us to function in complex environments. The version of yourself you bring to a job interview is not the same as the one you bring to dinner with close friends, and both of these are genuine. The mask that Greene is concerned with is something different. The persona that is constructed specifically to conceal the drives that the person themselves finds unacceptable. The insecurity that would be too vulnerable to show. The need for control that would be too revealing to admit. The envy that would be too shameful to acknowledge. These are covered, often with extraordinary skill, by a social presentation designed to generate exactly the opposite impression. The most common masks. False confidence is perhaps the most widely used. It is the person whose certainty appears absolute and whose manner discourages challenge, but who responds to any actual questioning of their authority with a disproportionate intensity that reveals, unmistakably, how fragile the confidence really is. True confidence, in contrast, tends to be quiet. It can afford to be questioned. Charm is one of the most powerful and most dangerous masks available. It works because we are wired to respond to it, to warmth, to humor, to the feeling of being genuinely seen by another person. The charming person who is also deeply self-interested has learned, usually unconsciously, to deploy these qualities in the service of their own agenda. The first sign that something is off is usually a slight mismatch between how the charming person makes us feel about them and how they make us feel about ourselves. Genuine warmth tends to leave people feeling more expansive. Performed charm tends to leave people feeling subtly managed. Victim mentality is a mask that is particularly difficult to navigate because it carries a moral authority that disarms normal judgment. The person who positions themselves as perpetually wronged, perpetually overlooked, perpetually the target of other people's bad intentions, creates an environment in which to respond critically to their behavior is to participate in their persecution. This is not to say that people do not experience genuine victimization. Of course they do. It is to say that victim identity, when it becomes a chronic operating mode rather than an accurate description of specific circumstances, tends to serve a particular function. It transfers responsibility for the person's own behavior to everyone else. Passive aggression is the expression of hostility through indirection. The email that takes 4 days to receive a 2-word reply. The compliment that contains, almost invisibly, a diminishment. The helpfulness that creates dependency rather than capability. The silence that speaks more clearly than any words. It is the preferred tool of people who have, for various reasons, learned that direct expression of conflict is dangerous, and who have therefore become expert at expressing it sideways. People-pleasing, finally, is often not recognized as a mask at all because it looks so much like virtue. The person who says yes to everything, who never expresses a competing preference, who subordinates their own needs with apparent ease, this appears to be generosity. But beneath it is often something more complicated. A deep anxiety about the consequences of disagreement. A need for approval so strong that it overrides authentic self-expression. And, eventually, a resentment that accumulates silently until it becomes unsustainable. The mask does not tell us who a person is, but the gap between the mask and what lies beneath it, if we learn to see it, tells us almost everything we need to know. Section 3. The Psychology of Manipulation. Manipulation is one of those words that carries so much charge, so much moral weight, so much implication of deliberate intent, that it is worth being careful about how we use it. Most manipulation is not a conscious strategy. It is an unconscious behavior pattern that has proven over time to produce a desired result. A child who discovered that distress generated parental attention may become an adult who, under stress, generates distress, not because they are calculating the effect, but because the pattern was established long before they had the capacity to examine it. This matters because it affects how we respond. The appropriate response to deliberate manipulation is different from the appropriate response to an unconscious behavior pattern that happens to be manipulative in effect. Understanding the difference is part of what Greene means when he calls for a deeper, more empathetic reading of human behavior. Patterns worth recognizing. Gaslighting is the experience of having your perception of reality systematically questioned by another person. It takes its name from a 1940s film in which a husband manipulates his wife into believing she is losing her mind. In everyday life, it appears in smaller and more ambient forms. The person who repeatedly denies having said what you clearly remember them saying, who frames your emotional responses as evidence of your instability rather than as appropriate reactions to their behavior, who creates a persistent fog of uncertainty around your own perceptions that leaves you more dependent on their version of reality than on your own. Emotional guilt is the use of your own empathy against you. Someone who understands that you are caring, that you take responsibility seriously, that you are sensitive to causing pain, can use that knowledge to redirect your attention from their behavior to your response to it. The conversation that began with you raising a concern ends with you apologizing. This is not accidental. It is the operation of a pattern, however unconscious, that has learned exactly where to apply pressure. Love bombing, the overwhelming, rapid, often intense expression of affection, admiration, or attention at the beginning of a relationship, creates a particular kind of vulnerability. It works because genuine intimacy is one of the things most people genuinely want. When it arrives suddenly and abundantly, the natural response is gratitude, reciprocity, and a lowering of the defenses that normally allow us to evaluate whether someone's behavior over time matches their early presentation. By the time the behavior changes, the emotional investment is already substantial. Projection is perhaps the most intellectually interesting of the manipulative patterns, because it is simultaneously a defense mechanism and an accusation. The person who is lying accuses others of dishonesty. The person who is withholding affection complains of not being loved enough. The person who is controlling accuses others of being controlling. What is being projected is usually the exact quality the person is most ashamed of or least able to acknowledge in themselves. And the accusation, when it lands, can be profoundly disorienting, because it carries a conviction that feels, from the inside, like genuine perception. Playing the victim in response to accountability is a pattern that deserves specific attention, because it is one of the most effective circuit breakers available to someone who wants to avoid examining their own behavior. The moment a concern is raised, they become the wronged party. The conversation that was about their behavior becomes a conversation about how hard things have been for them, how unfairly they have been treated, how much they have sacrificed. The person who raised the concern is now managing the other person's distress, and the original issue has quietly dissolved. Recognizing these patterns does not require you to become cynical or to approach every difficult person as an adversary. It requires something more nuanced, the ability to see the pattern without being inside it, to notice what is happening while it is happening, to remain grounded in your own perception of events while maintaining enough compassion to understand that the person enacting these patterns is, usually, not doing so in full awareness. Understanding the mechanism of manipulation is not about becoming suspicious. It is about becoming clear. And clarity, quietly and consistently applied, is the most effective protection available. Section 4. How to protect your mind. Let's talk about what actually works. Because the challenge with difficult people is not that we fail to notice that something is wrong. Most people, most of the time, have an accurate intuitive sense that something about a relationship or interaction is off. The challenge is what we do with that sense. We second-guess it. We talk ourselves out of it. We extend benefit of the doubt long past the point where the doubt has been settled. We prioritize the other person's comfort over our own perception. Greene's philosophy offers a different orientation. Not suspicious, not defensive, but fundamentally rooted in accurate seeing. And from accurate seeing, appropriate response becomes possible. Observation before reaction. The single most valuable practice Greene recommends, and the one that requires the most discipline, is the development of a pause between what you observe and how you respond. Most of the power that difficult people have over others comes from the ability to trigger immediate emotional reactions. The criticism that makes you defensive before you've evaluated whether it has any merit. The guilt that makes you apologize before you've considered whether an apology is warranted. The provocative statement that pulls you into an argument before you've asked whether the argument is worth having. The pause is where your autonomy lives. In that small space between stimulus and response, you have the ability to ask, what is actually happening here? What do I observe separate from what I feel? What would a response look like that serves my interests rather than the other person's agenda? Marcus Aurelius, one of Greene's touchstones throughout The Laws of Human Nature, made this a daily practice. Leading an empire surrounded by advisors with conflicting interests and subordinates with their own agendas, he trained himself to observe his own reactions before acting on them. Not to suppress them, suppression is not the goal, but to understand them clearly enough that they could inform rather than control his responses. Emotional detachment as compassion. Emotional detachment is frequently misunderstood as coldness. It is not. It is the ability to remain genuinely present in a difficult interaction without being flooded by it. To see the other person clearly, including the pain or insecurity or fear that is driving their difficult behavior, without being captured by the emotional field they are generating. This is actually a more compassionate response than the emotional engagement it replaces. When we are emotionally flooded by a difficult person's behavior, when we react, defend, argue, or capitulate, we are not actually responding to them. We are responding to the emotional experience they have triggered in us. The detached observer can see the other person more accurately, can respond to what is actually there rather than to their own triggered state. In practice, this means maintaining an almost anthropological curiosity in difficult interactions. Instead of feeling wounded by the criticism, becoming curious about what the criticism reveals about the person offering it. Instead of being pulled into the guilt, noticing the mechanism by which the guilt is being generated. This is not a way of dismissing the other person. It is a way of understanding them more honestly than most people are willing to. The power of saying less. In interactions with people who are skilled at manipulation, consciously or unconsciously, the amount of information you provide about your emotional state, your vulnerabilities, your hopes, and your fears is the resource they have to work with. Saying less does not mean becoming closed or strategic. It means developing a higher threshold for what you share, with whom and when. There is a particular kind of wisdom in not explaining yourself to someone who is going to use the explanation against you. Not because honesty is wrong, but because honesty requires a context of genuine mutual respect to be productive. Offered into a context of manipulation, it simply provides more material. Knowing when to walk away. Greene is clear on a point that is often uncomfortable to accept. Not every difficult person can be understood their way into being less difficult. Some patterns are so deeply entrenched, some wounds so thoroughly defended, that no amount of empathy or skillful engagement on your part will change them. And continuing to invest in a relationship or dynamic that consistently costs more than it returns is not loyalty or compassion. It is a failure to protect something valuable, yourself. Knowing when to walk away requires the honest assessment of a question that most kind people find difficult to ask. Is this relationship serving any genuine purpose that cannot be better served by a different relationship? The answer is sometimes yes, and the continued investment, with appropriate boundaries and realistic expectations, is worth it. The answer is sometimes no. And the courage to act on that answer is one of the most important forms of self-respect available. The boundary is not a wall. It is a statement about what you will and will not participate in, offered not with aggression, but with the quiet authority of someone who has decided what they value. Section 5. Human Nature in the Modern World. Everything we have discussed so far is ancient. The insecurities, the masks, the manipulation patterns, the need for status. These are not modern inventions. They appear in the letters of Roman senators, the court records of Renaissance Italy, the philosophical observations of the Stoics. Human nature has not changed. What has changed is the environment in which it plays out, and the speed and scale at which it now operates. Social media, specifically, has created conditions that are extraordinarily favorable to the most problematic aspects of human nature, and extraordinarily challenging for the most constructive ones. The attention economy that powers most social platforms is built on a simple observation. Emotional arousal drives engagement. Outrage, fear, envy, tribal affiliation. These generate clicks, shares, and time on platform in a way that calm, nuanced consideration does not. The platforms have therefore been optimized through billions of dollars of engineering to surface and amplify exactly the content that triggers these states. Which means that every time you open a social feed, you are entering an environment specifically designed to activate the most reactive, least reflective parts of your psychology. In this environment, the difficult personalities Greene describes in The Laws of Human Nature find ideal conditions. The person with grandiose needs can construct a public self that receives the validation that real-world relationships would never consistently provide. The person with victim identity can find an audience that confirms and amplifies their narrative. The person who needs to control can manage the presentation of their life with a precision that real life never allows. The person with deep insecurity can measure their worth against others with a comprehensiveness and a frequency that would have been impossible in any previous era. Online arguments and why they drain us. One of the more specific applications of Greene's framework to modern life is the question of why online arguments feel so uniquely exhausting, and why they almost never produce the results we enter them hoping for. The answer is that online arguments are almost never actually about the topic they appear to be about. They are about status, about identity, about the need to be right in front of an audience. The person who disagrees with you online is not, in most cases, genuinely trying to understand your position or share theirs. They are performing, for their own followers, for themselves, for the psychological reward that comes from holding a position successfully against opposition. Engaging with this on its own terms is a losing proposition. The only available wins are to either dominate the exchange, which generates more heat and rarely changes any minds, or to disengage, which feels like retreat but is, in most cases, the strategically and psychologically superior choice. In the workplace, particularly in hybrid environments where some interactions are digital and some in person, the same dynamics play out with added complexity. Email and messaging platforms remove the non-verbal information that moderates human interaction. They make tone ambiguous, context missing, and interpretation more susceptible to projection. The passive-aggressive colleague has found their ideal medium. The person who manages up through skillful email forwarding has a powerful new tool. Navigating this requires exactly the kind of patient, observational intelligence that Greene advocates. The ability to read what is underneath the surface of the communication, not just what is written. Family dynamics and the oldest patterns. Nowhere are the patterns Greene describes more persistent or more deeply rooted than in family systems. This is because the family is where our earliest, most formative experiences of relationship occurred, where we learned what love looks like, what conflict looks like, what the exchange of affection and obligation and disappointment looks like. And the patterns formed in those early years have a durability that no subsequent relationship can fully overwrite. The difficult family member is difficult in ways that are often uniquely tailored to the specific vulnerabilities developed in childhood. They know, with an accuracy that strangers could never achieve, exactly where the pressure points are. This is not usually intentional. It is the natural consequence of having been present for the formation of those pressure points in the first place. Navigating family difficulty requires the additional challenge of doing so in a context where disengagement is often neither possible nor desirable, where the relationship has too much genuine value or too many legitimate obligations, or too much love mixed in with the difficulty to be simply walked away from. Here, the practices of emotional detachment, of observation before reaction, of saying less, of protecting what is genuinely yours, become not optional philosophical refinements, but daily survival skills. Technology amplifies human nature. It does not change it. The same wisdom that protected Marcus Aurelius from the difficult people of ancient Rome will protect you from the difficult people of the digital age. Section 6. Becoming hard to manipulate. I want to be careful about something as we approach the end of this documentary, because a video about difficult people and manipulation and protective strategies can leave a viewer in a particular emotional state, one of wariness, of guardedness, of a kind of low-level suspicion toward the people in their lives. And that state, however understandable, is the opposite of what we are aiming for. The goal is not to become suspicious of everyone. People who become suspicious of everyone in the name of self-protection tend to produce, through that very suspicion, the isolation and relational difficulty they were trying to avoid. Suspicion reads as hostility. Hostility generates defensive responses. Defensive responses confirm the suspicion. The loop closes, and the person inside it is not protected. They are imprisoned. Nor is the goal to become emotionally cold. The capacity for warmth, for genuine connection, for vulnerability within appropriate relationships, these are not weaknesses to be eliminated. They are among the most valuable things a human life can contain. The person who amputates their emotional availability in the name of never being hurt again has made a trade that is not worth making. What Greene is pointing toward is something more nuanced and more difficult to achieve. The ability to see people clearly, with their complexity, their contradictions, their defenses, their wounds, their genuine qualities alongside their difficult ones, and to respond to what is actually there rather than to what we project onto them or what they project onto us. This is emotional intelligence in its most mature form. Not the management of emotions in the shallow sense, the performance of equanimity, the suppression of reaction, but genuine understanding of yourself, of others, of the dynamics that emerge between people when their particular histories and needs and wounds encounter each other. The person who has developed this understanding becomes genuinely hard to manipulate, not because they are defended, but because they are clear. They can see the pattern while it is happening. They can feel the pull of guilt or flattery or provocation without being governed by it. They can choose their response rather than simply having one. And they can maintain enough compassion for the difficult person to understand that the difficulty is almost always a form of pain, without confusing compassion with permission. True wisdom in dealing with difficult people is not seeing fewer people as difficult, it is seeing more people as human, and understanding that these two things are not in conflict. The mindful reflection. Let me leave you with something that I think matters more than any of the strategies we've discussed. The people who are most difficult in your life are almost certainly not difficult on purpose. They are operating from patterns that were formed long before they had the capacity to examine them, from wounds that were never fully healed, from fears that were never fully resolved, from needs that were never adequately met. This does not excuse the harm their behavior can cause. It does not require you to remain in relationships that damage you. It does not mean that impact should be excused because the intent was not cruel. But it does mean something important for how you carry the weight of those relationships. The person who hurt you is not, in Greene's deepest reading of human nature, primarily a villain in your story. They are a person living inside their own story, one in which they are not the difficult one, in which their behavior makes complete internal sense, in which the pain they cause is either invisible to them or is justified by a narrative you are not privy to. Understanding this does not require you to agree with the narrative. It simply gives you access to something more useful than either rage or despair: genuine comprehension. And comprehension, clear, honest, compassionate comprehension of why people behave the way they do, is the foundation of everything Greene is pointing toward. It is what allows you to respond rather than react, to protect yourself without becoming bitter, to maintain your kindness without sacrificing your clarity, to love the people in your life with open eyes rather than closed ones. This is the work of a lifetime. It does not become easy, but it becomes, gradually and reliably, more possible the more you practice it. The strongest mind is not the one that controls others. It is the one that cannot easily be controlled. And the path to that mind is not armor. It is understanding. Before you go, I want to ask you something real. We've all had to navigate difficult people. We've all been confused, drained, or affected by someone whose behavior seemed inexplicable until, maybe just now, maybe at some earlier point, it finally started to make sense. What is the most valuable lesson you've learned from dealing with a difficult person in your life? Not the lesson they taught you intentionally, the lesson that came from the difficulty itself, from having to figure out how to navigate something that didn't come with instructions. Leave it in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of understanding that is more useful when it's shared. If this video gave you a new way of seeing someone in your life, or a new way of seeing yourself in those interactions, share it with someone who might need it. These conversations tend to find the people who are ready for them. And in our next episode of Robert Greene Applied, we're moving from the psychology of relationships into the psychology of strategy. We'll be exploring the 33 strategies of war applied to entrepreneurship, where we'll discover why building a business often feels like navigating an invisible battlefield, and how timeless strategic thinking can help entrepreneurs survive uncertainty, fierce competition, and the kind of rapid change that no business plan fully accounts for. If you've ever felt like you were fighting a war you didn't fully understand, that episode is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and take good care of yourself and of the people in your life who are doing the best they can.